Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be digging into something I know has been on everyone's mind. CMMC, specifically the DoD's, well, they call it a finalized rule, 32 CFR section 170. It was just published on, let me get the date right, there it is, date the rules published. And listen, we know you all are trying to win those DoD contracts, and this rule, well, it changes things. So
yeah,
we're going to break it all down, cut through the noise so you can get right to it.
It's definitely one to pay attention to for sure. This goes way beyond checking a box on a form. The DoD is serious about this, protecting sensitive information. It's only getting more important, especially with all that's going on these days.
Right. Makes sense. Okay, so the DoD's had cybersecurity requirements. I mean, they've been around for a while. So what's different now? We keep hearing CMMC 2.0. Why the big push all of a sudden?
Well, the landscape, it's not what it used to be. The bad guys are getting smarter, sneakier. We're seeing attacks on supply chains and the stakes. They're higher than ever, especially for national security. So CMMC 2.0, it's about making sure the entire defense industrial base, everyone involved, they're not just compliant on paper, that they can actually, stand up to these threats that keep getting more advanced.
So it's about real protection, not just going through the motions, checking boxes and hoping for the best. But they did simplify things a bit with this new version, right? I mean, that's what we keep hearing.
Definitely. Remember how it used to be 5 levels? Yeah, that's gone. Now it's just 3. Level 1, level 2, and level 3.
3 level. Okay, so if our listeners are hearing that and thinking, okay, that sounds maybe doable, which level should they be shooting for? What's realistic?
It all depends. Depends on the work you're doing for the DoD. If you're only working with federal contract information, FCI, then level 1, that's your target. And when we say FCI, we mean like your basic contract stuff, okay? Contract numbers, what you're getting paid, delivery schedules, that kind of thing.
Gotcha. So not classified info, but you got to treat it right, of course. What about when it comes to Controlled Unclassified Information, the CUI?
That's where level 2 comes in. CUI is a whole other animal. We're talking technical drawings, the source code of software, even information about government personnel. If you're handling that CUI, you're probably looking at level 2. That's going to be the requirement most of the time.
And level 3, that's what, the big leagues?
Yeah, you could say that. Level 3 is the top, the most sensitive contracts, the kind with, really sensitive information. We're talking about weapons systems, intelligence, that kind of stuff. Think of it as need-to-know level access. And those assessments, they're different too, much stricter. DoD handles those directly.
Directly, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, DoD-led assessments for level 3. Got it. But before we go deeper into each level, let's talk about something I know everyone's wondering about. Self-assessments. They're back with CMMC 2.0, right?
They're back, yeah, but there are some caveats. For level 1, you're fine with a self-assessment. But for level 2, you're going to need a third party, a CMMC third-party assessment organization or C3PAO. They're the ones who will do these.
Right, the C3PAOs. Okay, we're going to definitely come back to them. They're important in all this. But first, let's make sure everyone really understands these levels. Let's say our listeners are ambitious. They want those DoD contracts. So walk us through each level. What does it really take to comply? What do you actually have to do?
Okay, sure. So level 1, that's the most basic. But don't think that means it's easy. You've still got to show you're meeting 17 different cybersecurity requirements. We're talking fundamental stuff here, the basics, like how do you control who gets into your systems? How are you protecting data if someone shouldn't have access to it? Do you have a plan for when something goes wrong? What's your incident response? Basic stuff, but you've got to have it.
Strong foundation.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so what about level 2 then? That's where a lot more contractors are going to fall, right?
Yeah, you're right. Level 2 is the most common. CUI covers a lot, so. And this is where it gets serious. We're talking about 110 security requirements. You've probably heard of NIST SP 800-171, right? It's mainly based on that. 110,
wow. Okay, so we went from 17 to 110. That's a jump. Give us an idea, what are some examples? What are some of these requirements?
Well, for example, multi-factor authentication, that's a must for getting into your systems. And then encryption, got to have strong encryption, both when the data is just sitting there and when it's moving around. And you need continuous monitoring of your network. You got to be on the lookout for suspicious activity. Basically, you got to have a really tight ship when it comes to cybersecurity, and it's got to cover everything.
So level 2, that's where companies, a lot of them, they're really going to have to step it up. Now, what about those plans of action and milestones? I think I even hear people just calling them POA&Ms now. can you still use those? Like, if you're not quite meeting every requirement, can you get some extra time?
The million-dollar question. It's not simple.
The DoD's gotten stricter about POA&Ms with CMMC 2.0.
It's more complicated.
So you can't just keep pushing things off hoping no one notices.
Exactly, and the DoD's been clear about that. The essential stuff, the core security controls, those have to be in place right away. No exceptions. Things like your incident response, how you control access, how you manage risk, that all has to be ready to go.
Got it. No shortcuts on the fundamentals. Makes sense. Now, before we get into POA&Ms and the C3PAOs, let's talk cost. I mean, let's be real. This isn't going to be cheap. So let's be upfront about it. How much is this all going to cost?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? No one likes talking about money, but it's a business at the end of the day. And doing business with the DoD, it means you got to be ready to invest in security.
Right, for sure. Do we have any, ballpark figures? What are we talking here?
So the DoD, they've released some estimates, average costs, but keep in mind, your mileage may vary. It all depends, right? How big's your company, how good's your security already, and of course, which CMMC level you're aiming for. That makes a difference too.
Okay, so let's break down. What are the biggest expenses our listeners need to be ready for?
Think of it in a couple buckets. First, you got your upfront costs, one-time things to get your cybersecurity house in order. That might mean bringing in a consultant, someone to help you figure out what you need. Or maybe you got to create new policies, procedures, the whole 9 yards. Or even, upgrading your IT stuff, the hardware, the software, who knows? Depends on what you got.
So those are the initial investments, getting up to speed.
Yeah.
Then what? What about the costs that keep coming back, once you're CMMC compliant? What then?
Right, because this isn't a one-and-done deal. You got to keep at it.
Yeah.
So you'll have your recurring costs, things like training your employees, got to do that every year, keep everyone sharp. Then there's the vulnerability scanning, got to do that regularly, and penetration testing, those are big ones. And of course, all the paperwork, all the documentation, got to keep that up to date too.
Right, because proving you're compliant, that never really goes away.
Yeah.
Now, what about the C3PAOs, the assessors? We talked about them before. They're the ones who do the level 2 assessments, right? So how much does that add to the bill?
Yeah, the C3PAOs, they're essential, but they don't come cheap. Their fees, well, it really depends. How long's the assessment going to take? How complex is your setup? They're going to need time to interview people, go through your documentation, and then there's the assessment report itself. That all takes time.
So it's like anything else. It pays to shop around, right?
Exactly. Don't just go with the first C3PAO you find. Do your homework, get quotes from a few different ones, and don't just look at the price tag either. Experience matters, so does expertise. Find a C3PAO that knows your industry, that understands the kind of CUI you're dealing with. That makes a difference.
Like a partner, not just someone taking boxes.
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked about what CMMC is, the levels, the requirements, the assessments, the costs. But what about the how? What can our listeners actually do right now to get ready?
That's the question, right? And the good news is you don't need to climb Mount Everest on day one. Start simple. Figure out what you got. What kind of information are you handling? Is there CUI in there? Once you know what you're dealing with, then you can start comparing, see how your current setup measures up to those CMMC requirements.
So taking inventory, seeing what's what.
Exactly, and write it all down. Documentation, that's key. And I don't just mean scribbling on a napkin. You need solid records, your policies, procedures, training logs, anything that proves you're doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Ah, yes, documentation. The bane of every security professional's existence.
I hear you. But seriously, it's your audit trail. It's what proves you're doing things right.
So true. Okay, so once you know where you stand with your cybersecurity, how it lines up with CMMC, what's next?
Prioritize. Figure out where your weak spots are. Maybe you're good on access control, but your incident response needs work. Focus your energy where it matters most.
Create a roadmap, step by step. And what are those gaps? Where can our listeners go for help?
That's where the registered provider organizations come in, the RPOs. They're the experts. Think of them as your CMMC guides. The CMMC accreditation body, they authorize the RPOs to give advice, to consult, even provide training.
Got it. So if you need help, find an RPO. Any other tips for navigating this whole CMMC thing?
Don't forget about the free stuff. Seriously, the DoD, they've got tons of information on their website. The full rule itself, FAQs, fact sheets, even templates, it's all there. And NIST, they're another great resource. They've got tons of stuff on cybersecurity best practices, a lot of which, directly applies to CMMC.
Free and useful. Love it. Now let's talk about those POA&Ms again. You said they're still allowed, but with limitations.
Yeah, POA&M. So level 1, forget it. You got to have all 17 requirements met right from the start.
No exceptions.
Right. But level 2, you might have some wiggle room. If you're not 100% compliant with everything during the assessment, you might be able to use a POA&M for some things, but not everything.
So, little breathing room for level 2, but not a free pass. What are the but not everything things?
The DoD calls them high weight requirements. Those are untouchable, non-negotiable. We're talking about the core security stuff, absolutely essential for protecting CUI. Incident response, access control, risk management, all that has to be in place. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Got it. The essentials are essential. So what about the POA&Ms that are allowed? What are the rules there?
First of all, it can't be vague. You can't just say, we're working on it. You got to have a real plan with details, specific tasks, who's responsible for what, and firm deadlines. The DoD is not messing around.
So it's like a project plan for fixing your security gaps. How long do you have to actually fix this stuff once you've submitted to POA&M?
You get 180 days, 6 months, that's it. Clock starts ticking the day of your assessment. And the DoD, they're keeping tabs. They can and they will check up on you, make sure you're making progress hitting those deadlines.
So no procrastinating. Any final thoughts on POA&Ms?
Use them strategically, that's all I'll say. Don't rely on them. The goal is to be fully compliant, not to barely scrape by.
Solid advice. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's a hot topic these days. Cloud security. So much is moving to the cloud, right? What does that mean for CMMC? How does that all work? Yeah, picking up on that cloud security question everyone wants to know. It's like this whole other world. Yeah. How does CMMC fit in with cloud services?
It's tricky. People think, oh, it's in the cloud. It's someone else's problem. But it's not that simple. That whole shared responsibility thing that we hear about all the time, it's not just a buzzword. It's actually really important for CMMC and the cloud.
Okay, so for our listeners who are like using cloud services for everything, email, storing files, everything, what does shared responsibility actually mean? What are they on the hook for?
Think of it like this. You've got your cloud provider, right? They're responsible for the base layer, the physical data centers, the servers, the network, the building, if you will. They build the fortress, they make sure the walls are strong, the moat's full, all that. But what you bring inside the fortress, that's on you. Your data, the apps you're using, your users, how you control who gets access to what, how you keep all that secure, that's your job.
So even if it's not on your physical servers, you still got to lock it down, basically.
Yeah.
So what does that mean for someone trying to check all the CMMC boxes?
It means you can't just pass the buck. You can't say, oh, it's in the cloud, the CSP's got this. You still got to do your part. Implement security controls inside your cloud environment. And those controls, they got to match the CMMC level you're going for, of course. And the data's got to be protected appropriately, too.
So it's still about encryption, access control, incident response, all that, even in the cloud.
Exactly. Those are the basics. You can't skip those. And here's the thing. If your cloud provider, your CSP, if they're handling CUI as part of their service to you, well, they need a CMMC assessment too. And how well they're doing, that affects you directly.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So choosing the right CSP, that's a big deal. What should people be looking for, especially if they're dealing with CUI? That's not something to mess around with.
Right, you got to be picky. Not all CSPs are the same when it comes to this stuff. You want one that gets CMMC, that takes security seriously, and ideally, one that's already certified at the CMMC level you need. Don't be afraid to ask them for proof. Get it in writing.
They'll just take their word for it, get in the contract.
Exactly.
Now, a lot of companies, they're all about software as a service now, SaaS.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Things like Microsoft 365, Salesforce, even accounting software. It's all in the cloud these days. So how does CMMC apply to that, to the SaaS world?
Same principle applies. It's all about the data. If your SaaS app is touching CUI, it's part of your assessment. No way around it. You got to make sure that SaaS provider's meeting those CMMC-free requirements, whatever level you need. And remember that shared responsibility still applies. You got to configure the SaaS app right, control who's using it, have a plan if something goes wrong, the whole 9 yards.
So even if the app itself is super secure, if you don't set it up right, you're in trouble.
Exactly. It's a team effort, even with SaaS. And this is where it gets even more interesting. FedRAMP. Have you heard of that?
FedRAMP. Yeah, isn't that more for like big government agencies?
You're right. It is a government-wide program about assessing and authorizing cloud services. But here's why it matters for CMMC. The DoD said that some FedRAMP authorizations, they actually count towards CMMC.
Really? So if a company's working with a CSP that has like a FedRAMP, moderate authorization or higher, they're already ahead of the game with CMMC.
Potentially, yes, but, and this is a big but, it's not automatic. The DoD, they have very specific rules about what FedRAMP moderate equivalency actually means. And your CSP, they got to meet all those rules. Don't just assume. Get it in writing. Read the fine print.
So once again, it's about being informed, being thorough. This has been great, really helpful. Any parting words of wisdom for our listeners who are, let's be honest, probably a little overwhelmed by all this CMMC stuff?
CMMC, it can seem like a lot, I get it, but it's a marathon, not a sprint. Take it one step at a time. Don't try to do everything at once. Use those resources we talked about, the DoD, NIST, the RPOs, they're there to help. And most importantly, make cybersecurity part of your company culture. When your whole team's on board, when they get it, you're not just checking boxes, you're building a stronger business, a safer business.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us. It's been really eye-opening. And for everyone listening, be sure to check out the show notes for this episode. We'll have links to all the resources we mentioned, plus more info on CMMC. Until next time, stay safe out there.
Cyber Explorer would like to remind our listeners that opinions of the author are his own and do not reflect those of his employer.